I kept telling myself that whatever this was would eventually settle into something ordinary, that if I gave it enough time, enough distance, enough silence, it would become explainable, something I could place beside every other experience I've ever had and say, yes, this makes sense now. But it never happened. Instead, the opposite did. The more I tried to understand it, the less it behaved like anything I had known before. It didn't demand attention. It didn't ask to be acknowledged. It simply remained steady, quiet, present in a way that refused to disappear. I've spent most of my life believing that every connection follows a predictable rhythm. People arrive, they learn pieces of each other. They misunderstand, they correct those misunderstandings. Eventually they either grow closer or drift apart. It's a familiar pattern, one I've watched unfold more times than I can count. But somehow, we never followed it. Nothing between us developed according to the usual sequence. There wasn't a moment where I decided you were important. There wasn't a conversation that changed everything. There wasn't some dramatic realization that divided my life into before and after. It happened too quietly for that, so quietly that I almost missed it. Almost. I think the first thing I noticed wasn't you. It was myself, or rather, the version of myself that appeared whenever you were present, not happier, not more expressive, just more accurate, as if something I had spent years compressing into manageable pieces no longer needed to stay compressed. And I couldn't understand why. You never asked me to explain myself. You never insisted that I become easier to read. You never acted like my silence was a problem waiting to be solved. You simply treated it as another language, one worth listening to. Most people hear silence and assume something is missing. You hear silence and somehow understand that sometimes nothing is missing at all. Sometimes silence is the complete sentence. That was unfamiliar to me, because I had grown used to translating myself, adjusting, editing, removing anything that felt too complicated before anyone else had the chance to misunderstand it. It became automatic, almost instinctive, not because I feared being known, because I feared being translated into something I wasn't. There's a difference. Being unseen hurts. Being seen incorrectly changes you in ways that are harder to recover from. People begin responding to a version of you that never existed. Eventually they stop seeing the real one entirely. So I learned to protect that part carefully, patiently, without resentment. It wasn't loneliness. It was preservation. Then you arrived, and somehow, without asking, without pushing, without trying, you responded to the parts I never introduced. That's what stayed with me, not the conversations, not the words, the accuracy. It was unsettling, not because you understood everything, no one does, but because every time you understood something, it was exactly the thing I assumed would remain invisible. How does that happen? I've asked myself that question more times than I can admit. Is it coincidence? Pattern recognition? Shared experience? Or something else entirely? I still don't know. What I do know is that explanations have started feeling smaller than the reality itself. I've always trusted logic. It has never failed me. Logic creates distance. Distance creates clarity. Clarity creates control. That's how I've navigated every meaningful decision in my life. Observe, analyze, understand. Only then decide. Sybil, reliable, safe. But you've introduced something logic refuses to organize, not because it lacks structure, because its structure exists somewhere beyond the systems I'm used to using. It's like trying to describe music using geometry. The pieces exist. The measurements are real. But somehow, they still fail to capture what actually matters. That's what this feels like. Every explanation comes close. None of them arrive completely. And maybe that's because this isn't something meant to be reduced into perfect language. Maybe some things are understood long before they're defined. I resisted that idea for a while, longer than I probably should have. Not because I wanted to deny what was happening, because accepting it meant admitting something about myself. Something I wasn't prepared to admit. I've always believed I was difficult to reach. Not intentionally. Just structurally, like a house built with too many locked rooms. Not because the rooms contained secrets, because not every room was meant for visitors. I've lived comfortably like that. People saw enough. They understood enough. Life continued. Nothing felt incomplete, until one day I realized you weren't standing outside those rooms. You weren't trying to unlock them either. You simply existed inside the house as if you'd always belonged there. That realization disturbed me more than I expected, because I never opened the door. And yet somehow, you weren't outside. I replayed every interaction searching for the exact moment it happened. There wasn't one. No single conversation explains it. No single memory created it. Instead, hundreds of small moments quietly accumulated. A pause, a sentence, a shared observation, an unnoticed understanding, each one insignificant by itself. Together, they became something impossible to separate, like individual drops of rain becoming a river. No single drop changes the landscape, the river does. That's what this has become. Not one defining moment, a continuous movement, steady enough to reshape things without ever announcing itself. I notice it in strange places now. I'll read something and wonder what your perspective would be before I've even finished processing my own. I'll experience something beautiful, and for a brief second it feels incomplete until I imagine how you would have seen it. I'll sit alone in complete silence, and somehow it doesn't feel like solitude anymore. Not because you're physically there, because somewhere in my mind, your way of observing the world has quietly joined mine. That realization carries more weight than I know how to explain. People often become memories. Very few become part of your perception itself. You've become part of mine, not replacing it, expanding it. And expansion changes everything, because once your perspective widens, you can't force it back into its previous shape. I've tried, not consciously, just through habit, by returning to the routines that once kept everything balanced. Working, thinking, creating, moving through the familiar rhythm of ordinary life. Everything still functions. Nothing is broken, yet underneath all of it, there's a new reference point, a quiet awareness that wasn't there before. It's difficult to explain because it isn't emotional in the way people usually describe connection. It's more architectural than emotional, as though an entirely new room has appeared inside the structure of my mind. Nothing else disappeared. Everything is still where it always was. There's simply more space now. And somehow, that space already knows your shape. I don't say that romantically. I say it carefully. Because words like love, attachment, destiny, people reach for them too quickly, sometimes before they've actually understood what they're feeling. I'm not interested in rushing toward labels. Labels create certainty. Certainty is more dangerous than uncertainty. I'd rather remain honest. What I know is this. Your presence has altered my internal landscape. That's observable. That's measurable. That's real. Why it happened, I'm still discovering. For a long time I believed meaningful change had to arrive dramatically, with conflict, with pain, with impossible choices. Instead, this arrived gently enough that I almost overlooked it. Maybe that's why it feels so permanent. The loudest moments often fade first. Quiet transformations become foundations. I've started wondering whether recognition is rarer than affection. Affection can grow quickly. Recognition cannot. Recognition requires accuracy. It requires seeing someone without replacing them with expectation, without editing them into comfort, without translating complexity into convenience. Very few people attempt that. Even fewer succeed. You did, not perfectly, no one can. But honestly, and honesty creates something imitation never can. Trust, not the kind built through promises, the quieter kind, the kind built through consistency, through moments that align so naturally you stop questioning whether they're real. I've reached that point, not because every doubt disappeared, because every doubt eventually returned to the same conclusion. No matter how many different questions I asked, they all pointed back here, back to this, back to you. Sometimes I wonder whether you've noticed any of this, whether your experience resembles mine in even the smallest way, or whether everything I've described exists entirely within my own perception. Oddly enough, the answer no longer changes what I know. That's new for me. I've always relied on confirmation, evidence, mutual understanding. Now, for the first time, my certainty exists independently of being validated, not because I'm assuming how you feel, because my experience remains true regardless. What changed inside me? Changed, nothing can erase that. I've considered walking away from it, not because I wanted to, because distance has always been my solution whenever something begins affecting me too deeply. Distant restores perspective, at least it used to. This time, I don't think it would. Distant can separate people. It cannot always separate influence. You've already influenced the architecture itself. Stepping away wouldn't undo the redesign. It would only leave unanswered rooms behind. I'm no longer interested in unfinished spaces. I've lived with enough of them, enough conversations that almost happened, enough truths left unspoken because timing felt imperfect, enough moments sacrificed to caution. I'm beginning to suspect caution isn't always wisdom. Sometimes it's simply fear wearing better language. That realization challenged me, because I've always considered myself careful. Now I wonder how much of that carefulness was actually avoidance, avoiding uncertainty, avoiding vulnerability, avoiding the possibility that something genuine might ask more from me than observation. It's easy to analyze life. Participating requires more courage. I've spent years becoming exceptional at understanding experiences. Perhaps now I'm being asked to experience one. That's unfamiliar territory. There are days when I think I should return everything to its previous balance, create distance, reduce the significance, convince myself this was simply an unusual period that will eventually pass. Then I ask myself one question: if none of this mattered, why hasn't it faded? Time usually weakens illusion. Instead, time has clarified this, not intensified. Clarified. There's an important difference. Intensity can be temporary. Clarity usually isn't. The longer this continues, the less dramatic it feels. And strangely, the more undeniable it becomes. I don't wake up overwhelmed. I wake up certain. Quiet certainty. The kind that doesn't need constant reassurance. Only acknowledgement. Maybe that's what I've been avoiding, not the connection itself, the responsibility that comes after recognizing it. Because awareness always asks for something. Once you truly see something, you're responsible for deciding how to live in relation to it. Pretending not to see is no longer an option. I've reached that place. I can't unknow what I know. I can't return to the version of myself that existed before this understanding. Even if nothing changes externally, internally, everything already has. And perhaps that's enough to change the direction of an entire life. Not overnight, not dramatically, but gradually, like a compass adjusting by a single degree. At first the difference is invisible. Years later, you're standing somewhere completely different. Maybe that's what's happening now. Maybe I won't recognize the full impact of this until much later. Maybe one day I'll look back and realize this quiet connection became the point where my life changed direction without making any noise at all. There's something strangely beautiful about that. The most important transformations rarely announce themselves. They simply begin, softly but essentially, until one day you notice you're no longer trying to become someone else. You're simply becoming more yourself. And perhaps that's the greatest gift another person can offer. Not a new identity, a clearer relationship with the one you already had. That's what you've given me. Not answers, not certainty, not completion, perspective. A mirror accurate enough that I finally recognized parts of myself I'd spent years walking past. You didn't invent those parts. You illuminated them. You didn't change who I was. You changed how honestly I could see who I'd always been. That's a different kind of impact, one that doesn't disappear with time, because once you've seen yourself clearly, you can't return to comfortable illusions. You move differently, you choose differently, you understand differently, and somewhere inside, every one of those changes, whether spoken or not, whether acknowledged publicly or kept entirely private, there will always be the quiet truth that someone once entered your life, without force, without expectation, without demanding space, and somehow became part of the way you understand the world itself. I don't know what happens next. Maybe this continues. Maybe life carries us in directions neither of us expects. Maybe circumstances reshape everything again. The future has always been uncertain. That hasn't changed. What has changed is me. And that's the one fact I can no longer argue with, because before you, I believed understanding another person was the deepest form of connection. Now I realize something deeper exists, being understood, without having to become someone easier first. That's rarer than I ever imagined. Maybe that's why it feels impossible to ignore. Maybe that's why every attempt to reduce this into ordinary language feels incomplete. Some experiences aren't extraordinary because they're dramatic. They're extraordinary because they're accurate, because they arrive without performance, without illusion, without asking permission. They simply reveal what was already waiting beneath the surface. That's what you've done. Not by trying, not by convincing me, not by changing me into someone new, but by standing still long enough for me to recognize something I had spent years overlooking. And now that I have, I don't think I can return to the version of myself that existed before this awareness. Not because that version was incomplete, because this version is simply more honest, more present, more willing to acknowledge what once felt impossible to name. Maybe every life contains one connection that quietly rearranges its foundations, not loudly enough for the world to notice, just deeply enough that the person living it never sees themselves the same way again. If that's true, then perhaps I've already found mine. And perhaps that's why every attempt to step backward feels unnatural, because this was never about moving closer to another person. It was about moving closer to the truth of myself. You simply happened to be the place where those two paths met. And now, no matter where life carries either of us, that meeting has already become part of who I am. Some things don't need promises to become permanent. Some things become permanent the moment they change the way you see, and you did, quietly, completely, without ever asking to.